This chapter will discuss the structure of political society in Pacific Asian countries and how different sectors of society participate in the political process. State-centric view states that we cannot understand societal forces such as citizens, the middle class, the business community, labor, student activities, or elites without referring back to the state and its purposes and activities. Society-centric approach states that the state is the product of the interplay of various forces in society, like rise of democracy and modernization theory, social classes, revolutions, and social movements. The chapter intends to highlight the point that, while citizens have equal constitutional rights to participate in the political process, the patterns of their actual participation, the ways in which they participate, and the level of effectiveness of their participation are very much affected by the overall structure of the political society, the prevalent social norms and behavioral values, and individuals' ascriptive role and position in society. Moreover, given the varied degrees of effectiveness and feasibility for individual citizens, some methods of political participation are favored over others. Two diverging perspectives on state-society relations were pioneered by Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, and Talcott Parson. Max Weber pioneered the state-centric view, which has led scholars to be inclined to understand the forces and structure of society from the perspective of the vision and functions, as well as the political and institutional dynamics of the state. On the other hand, Karl Marx and Emile Durkheim consider the state's action and the society's politics to be primarily a reflection of a fundamental dynamics of socio-economic shift and variation. Society-centric approach influenced the rise of modernization and dependency theory after the Second World War, which focused similarly on the effects of fundamental social and economic change on the state structure and government institution. Post-Second World War, Pacific Asia has been a fertile ground for a state-centric approach. Next, we'll discuss about being a politically active citizen in Pacific Asian countries. Citizenship is a modern concept. It is an important institution that defines the relationship between the state and an individual in modern societies, and provides the institutional basis for the interaction between the state and its citizens. There are two dimensions to this. First, whether citizens are given equal rights and opportunities for political participation, and second, in what forms or methods citizens participate in politics and how effective they are. On the first dimension, the right to vote is one of the key indicators. the development of the concept and practices of citizenship in Pacific Asian countries was strongly influenced by the universal suffrage movement in the late 19th and early 20th century in Europe. For example, Malaysia and Indonesia. The idea of citizenship based on race or religion was attempted in the early years of state formation at the time of independence, but the principle of universal suffrage eventually prevailed. In the communist countries, and in many non-communist countries too, citizens' rights were granted constitutionally in principle, but in reality, the exercise of these rights became very difficult and an entirely different political show. In countries run by a military or other authoritarian government, political rights were suspended completely. In yet other countries, elections were still regularly held, but the specific design or even manipulation of the electoral system and party system rendered these elections almost meaningless. Next are the methods of political participation and action. We'll discuss if there is a pattern of preference in methods of political participation in Pacific Asian countries, and people in Pacific Asian countries may prefer political participation through informal institutions. Moreover, individuals in Pacific Asian countries are more passive than active participants. A primary factor affecting preferences in methods of political participation is the credibility of formal institutions. A significant proportion of Pacific Asia population agree or strongly agree that politics and governments are so complicated that sometimes they don't understand what is happening. The reasons for the lack of credibility of formal institutions are many. First, it has partly to do with the history of post-Second World War politics and government in these countries that were dominated by authoritarianism, elitism, one party or a single dominant party, and closed-door politics. Second, the history of modern institutions in most Pacific Asian countries is very short. Third, modern political institutions originated mainly outside Pacific Asia. The lack of respect for formal institutions not only leads to their avoidance in the real political process, but also more violent challenges to them by those who have limited or no access to informal institutions, and therefore no alternatives to formal institutions. Boycotts, sit-ins, and street demonstrations become useful methods for them. The collective action problem in Pacific Asian countries seems to be rather different and appears to lie mainly in other forms of political participation. For example, because of the generally much harsher political and social consequences for individuals participating in unlawful political actions such as occupying buildings or factories or taking part in a street demonstration, and the fact a successful outcome from political action will benefit everyone regardless of whether they participate or not. An individual may well choose not to participate. A consequence of this is the underdevelopment of political society in many Pacific Asian countries, except for the formal institutions of voting, which the function of pluralist politics requires. Having laid out the general institutional settings for political participation and how it affects the preference of individuals and the extent of their participation, we now turn to specific forms of political participation that will help to illustrate the point further. 1. People power revolutions. People power revolutions were a dominant mode of political participation in Pacific Asian countries in the 1980s and the 1990s. People power revolution, therefore, is not a conventional form of political participation within the existing political system but rather a form of political action against it. This constitutes an important part of the pattern of political participation and action in Pacific Asia. People generally participate in voting as well as people power revolution as a collective action, but are less active in other forms of political participation that requires individual effort. Being a politician is the most effective way of participating in politics and policy processes. The political system is a great diversity which allows individuals to become politicians. In Pacific Asian countries, political systems are hierarchical and processes tend to be top-down. Here, we summarizes 5 typical paths through which a person may become a politician in Pacific Asian countries. A large number of politicians enter politics from a background of a successful lawyer. Lawyers are traditionally not as socially prestigious or politically influential in Pacific Asian countries. Only recently have there been signs of lawyers turning into politicians in Korea and Taiwan. President Roh Moo-hyun of South Korea and President Chen Shui-bian of Taiwan are typical examples. Both had legal backgrounds. Pacific Asian politics and government are dominated by business people turned politicians. One classic example of this is Japan's Kakue Tanaka, who was Prime Minister of only 2 years in the early 1970s. His business both financed and benefited from his political career. Similarly, the recent case of Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand indicates the same pattern of a mixture of business and politics in a politician's career. Thaksin built the largest mobile phone company in Thailand and was said to be the richest person in Thailand when he entered politics in the mid-1990s. Military generals becoming politicians is another tradition with a long history in Pacific Asian countries. This was the case with Park Chung-hee and Chun Do-hwan of South Korea, Suharto of Indonesia, and Premtin Sulanonda and others of Thailand. Similarly, the post-Marcos Philippines elected the former army chief under the Marcos regime as its second president under the new 1987 constitution. The fourth model is perhaps of more Pacific Asian character, becoming a politician because a parent is or was also an influential politician. They are known as hereditary politicians. Well-known examples of hereditary politicians include Chiang Ching-kuo, who succeeded his father, Chiang Kai-shek, as president in Taiwan. Finally, there's a category of career politicians who started a career in politics often as a worker in the party, election campaign organizer, or an assistant to a MP, and worked upwards through the party apparatus. The Chinese Community Youth League, or the CCYL, is the principal platform for this. Now, let's talk about how a politician generates and sustains political support. To be an effective politician, it requires the continual support of his political bases. There are different platforms and mechanisms that a politician can use to generate and sustain political support. Those in a pluralist polity and those in a non-pluralist polity. Who are the elites? There are two different approaches to the concept of elites. One set of definition focuses narrowly on the state elites, or those occupying positions of power in the government. And a broadly based concept of elites include both state and social elites, but with more emphasis on the role of social, economic, and civic elites on government and politics. This definition of elites is particularly useful in countries such as the Philippines, where a very small but powerful group of landed elites and others dominated society. Let's talk about how elites influence politics and government. Each elite group has its own way of influencing government and politics. Here, we summarize briefly the most practiced methods. First is building personal relations with potential and current policymakers. This is elites' one way of influencing politics by having a say in building relationship with the policymakers. Second is being a part of the process of shaping public opinion and elite attitudes. Even if they do not own a media business, their views would be highly respected among the public. They can be influential in national agenda setting and swing public opinion. Third is the political donations. The fact that they possess tremendous financial and material resources gives them access and influence. Fourth is leading social movements. Because of the elite's national influence and resources, and the unique interest they have in a particular social sector, they can be natural candidates to lead social movements and campaign on national issues. Last is forging political alliances. Elites choose to cooperate among themselves because of the fear of the dangers inherent in segmental cleavages and a desire to avert them, and the prior existence of a tradition of accommodation of elites.